paper and then putting it online. That was 10 years ago. And now we're talking about what many people call Web 3.0, right? So this is the platform economy. So what I think might be helpful to think about this is think about this as like the Netflix of education. So you might take, let's say, a digital badge in one course or one module, and then the platform will say, well, how about these 3 other options, right? So in this way, over time, someone could actually make a customized path into something they're interested in that's really built around the things they've already done that they seem to be interested in, using machine learning and other algorithms to kind of match people with opportunities. And in that sense, it uncovers a lot of things they might not have been exposed to before. But on the other hand, this machine learning is collecting data every time they use it. Do we have the infrastructure to make sure that that data is not exploited? So that's part of the things, those are part of the questions that we're going to ask today.
So let's take a step back and think about the broader context here. What is motivating these shifts? In most countries, education institutions have been slow to respond to change in demand for certain skills and industries. Higher education has long been the building block for workers and learners, but over time it's been out of reach because of scheduling commitments and rising costs. Some education institutions have actually reinvented their offerings to reach a wider pool of learners. Learners are also adapting to modern needs, wherein technologies offer new ways of showing their value or selling themselves to employers. Working learners can also be aligned with learning that better fits their schedule and constraints. So what used to be a semester-long course can be broken into stackable modules that the working learner can complete on their own time frame.
Employers have also struggled to keep up with these new technologies, and they've been facing several different challenges that make it hard to rely only on the formal higher ed system. First of all, a lot of baby boomers and older generation folks have retired, especially during COVID. And in many countries, the demographics are such that the young people to replace them are just simply not as many. Second, a lot of employers struggle to keep their existing workforce up to date. And employers traditionally have underinvested in training and learning. So when learning and staying on top of technologies is critical to innovation moving forward, it's the small and medium-sized businesses in particular that struggle to stay on top of this with their managers and all of their workers. And so it's important for them, if they are the generators of a lot of the new jobs and growth, that we make sure that they're equipped to have that learning culture. Employers also are facing right now quite tight labor markets, so they have to look beyond just the people that have the formal degree into this broad pool of other people that don't, but that still may have a lot of the skills that they didn't obtain per se in a classroom, but they actually have learned them either in a boot camp or on a job or with military experience. How do you make sure that that gets captured and can translate into that broader ecosystem? And then finally, the nature of work itself is changing. So we have, in the US, for example, in retail, you have retailers using automated checkout. Whereas before, a worker may have done the same task every day, all day, with one thing. Now, their job is actually to oversee these automated checkout machines and problem solve when they start to break down, and to work with the customers to make sure that they don't get frustrated and they leave satisfied. Their job also now entails things like security, because now there aren't a lot of staff left. So they have to oversee, like, is anyone walking right out of the store? So the whole nature of their job, even though they're not in what we would call a tech job, has been impacted by tech, even in low-wage frontline sectors. Another big way in which work has changed is in the introduction of online platform freelance and gig work. As you can see, it's happening right now in Barcelona with the taxis going on protests because they're letting Uber back in, right? So this is another way in which these dynamics of formal work and gig work and freelance work are coming into our everyday lives. So as we talk to experts in this field, what we tried to do is take a lot of the concerns that they had and put them into some conceptual buckets. These are the types of questions that you might need to be thinking about as a government minister or as an education leader. And so the first and most common thing that you probably already have given a lot of thought to today is equity, right? So are we going to leave even more people behind? Because actually to date, the types of people that have engaged in a lot of these boot camps and online learning have been those who already have degrees. So the ship is already going in the wrong direction if you think about the Sustainable Development Goals of building an inclusive, equitable, and quality education and lifelong learning opportunities for all. We're actually swimming in the other direction right now. How do we turn that ship? Another issue with equity that is really critical is the algorithms and AI, right? So they bring in forms of bias that can be really challenging to monitor and oversee. So, for example, if you are a person with a disability and you're doing a job interview on a platform like HireVue that looks at the video, they're going to try to see how much your characteristics match those that already work in the job. And if you have a disability, you're going to not be close to the norm, so you're not going to get selected, right? So how do we monitor and check for all these forms of potential discrimination and bias that's built into AI? Another bucket here that we're going to put a bunch of questions in has to do with data privacy and data rights. So who's going to be using the data on these platforms and for what purposes? And how do you oversee whether that person who might be from a pretty vulnerable group to start with, who may not even be aware of what their data rights are or how to say when and when they don't want to share their data, how do you make sure that there's an infrastructure there? And how do you make sure that there's budget and capacity to educate people on data rights so that they're, when I talk to seniors, low-income seniors in the US who don't use the internet very much, they say, well, I don't use it because I'm afraid that I'm going to get into a scam and I don't know how to avoid them, right? So that confidence that people need to actually get online in the first place. Another bucket is interoperability, which is more of a technical term, but what it really means is how do the data pieces systems talk to each other? How can we make sure that if I get a badge in this system over here and then I go into another country or another state or another province, that will be recognized and it's all going to be interconnected? Or if I try to move from, let's say, a boot camp into a higher ed degree, do I need to start all over, or can I get some credit for what I already know? These are the kinds of things that we need to do to set up a standardized system, and Chris spoke earlier today about an open source architecture to start with. Once we have that architecture, then you can build on top of that in ways where things can talk to each other. But if we don't do that, the risk is that you get proprietary ecosystems that compete with each other. And that could increase costs as well as really limit the scale of what can be possible in terms of transferring learning across different sectors. And then finally, quality assurance is another massive bucket that those in higher ed will be pretty well versed in, I'm sure, which is how do you know if someone takes a boot camp that they actually learned what they're saying they learned? And how do you know how much credit to give someone and how good that's going to be? So it's important not just for making sure that learning is verifiable and you can trust what somebody is showing you, but also in the labor market, if somebody is trying to sell their skills to an employer, if that employer is confused about what that certificate means, we have over 1 million of them in the US right now, and so they often will, the student takes time to learn something, get a certificate or a little badge, then they go on the labor market and they're treated like an entry-level person because that employer has no idea what that certificate actually means.
So to ground what we've been talking about, we are going to provide 3 real-life examples or case studies of these technologies. First, a digital wallet can securely record learning and employment. This behaves similar to generating a job application package or a portfolio for employers. With a digital wallet, learners can 1, have their learning signaled to employers, and 2, have skills and multiple forms of learning recognized. But if I were to put myself in the shoes of a user, the danger here is, how will they even know how to use a digital wallet to their benefit? What are their data privacy rights? And if they were to use a wallet in a different context, would the technology work? Is the technology standardized across systems?
As another example, take some of those gig platforms. So right now, somebody could do tasks in a totally different country, right? One at a time. My friend is an app developer for a company in Norway, but he is from and lives in Mexico. Somebody like that, what happens if the income isn't, if the earnings aren't paid? What happens if someone feels like they were discriminated against? Which country do they go to try to figure out who's accountable for that? Right? So we don't have the social protections. We also don't have, let's say someone gets laid off, what is the safety net? Who's responsible if a lot of these benefits and security nets, safety nets are tied to a formal wage employment structure that is now global and gig-based? What do we do to make sure that people don't get exploited on these global labor platforms? And then this final case study is from a project that I've been starting with my colleague, Dr. Rayshawn Ray, where we're trying to use virtual reality with people who are incarcerated. In the United States, more than 2 million people are incarcerated at any given time, which is the highest in the world. And every year we release around 650,000 people into our communities, but 2/3 of them are rearrested within 3 years, partly because the access to reentry support and education while they're incarcerated is very fragmented and very limited. So our idea is, how could we broaden opportunity to this very vulnerable and marginalized population that frequently hasn't had a lot of opportunity in the past by taking examples and existing projects of reentry support and education and bringing it into a virtual reality environment. So someone could do a mock interview, they could get a sense of what that environment looks like, and it can build their confidence in that setting. They could do interactive mentoring sessions. And they could do it because you don't need an internet connection to use VR, and the goggles are pretty cheap. On the other hand, it's really challenging to build this kind of platform that we would bring in providers when we don't have clear prescriptions around what are the data privacy standards that we need to adhere to, and what are the protections to make sure that the quality is controlled so that the person's not doing all this education and then it's not really valued when they come out. Without that clarity, it's really hard, even as builders of these systems, to know how to even start in the beginning and what's going to be required on the other end. So how can a leader in education or a minister make sense of all this? What we want to present here is more like an agile framework for building policies and responses to technology in education and labor markets. So rather than starting in sort of this long project where you get all the requirements in the beginning and linearly produce, and then at the end of 10 years you release your system, instead you start smaller with a smaller defined scope, and you bring people into the process from the beginning. So you're going to need your technology folks, your experts, you're going to need your policy experts, and you're going to need your users, whether those are the employers or the learners or the higher ed folks. You need to get their input on everything from the beginning, start small, and then incrementally build up. So it's no longer the days of just procure everything out to an outsider and think that at the end it's going to work. It's an ongoing, living, breathing ecosystem. So, but you need to be thinking about what's the kind of capacity do I need? What kind of staff do I need internally in my governance, in my perch that's going to make this happen, who can pull all the right people in the right time? You're going to need a realistic scope that doesn't try to boil the ocean, because then you get too many expectations and it often will fail. You got to take on something small enough to actually see some success. And you need to be clear up front about what would success actually look like for this project. And obviously, if you're not building it with learners in mind from the beginning and making sure it's grounded in their needs, then it may not actually have value on the other end. So we thank you for listening today, and if you want to learn more about our landscape study, actually the white paper came out yesterday, and it's called Working and Learning in the Digital Age is the short title, and it's on the Brookings EDU website. In there, we also mentioned partners like the Learning Economy folks who are in the audience, and what they're doing. And we would recommend engaging with all these communities that are already growing, rather than trying to start from scratch.
Young people today are the most connected generation. They are already using technology-enabled platforms to learn, find jobs, and network. Returning to the theme of the Sustainable Development Goals, Target 4.3 of SDG 4 aims to ensure equal access to quality technical, vocational, and tertiary education by 2030. To achieve that, we will need a collective, intentional approach that addresses both the risks and opportunities. If countries aren't proactively engaged, we are leaving a serious risk of moving in the opposite direction of SDG 4 and leaving people even further behind. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm kind of absorbed by the promises and perils dichotomy and kind of where I'm left sitting. And I'm curious what the audience thinks. If you have questions, feel free to jump in, because I think this is an important debate for the conference. Thinking about how lucky we are to be here, how lucky we are to be online, and how many are not connected, and then so on and so forth. But it's also interesting how, how little you talked about traditional higher education institutions in that sense as well. So I'm thinking about there is this larger ecosystem of transformations that's taking place, and kind of where do we position higher education in that space? So I'm kind of setting this up for discussion, but I want to hear your thoughts in the audience if you have some. But I'll start off with maybe a more precise question on the AI data standards, because I think when you think about the privacy standards, what are some examples that we can look to say, oh, this is what a higher education institution is doing. Here's an example that I can learn from. Any other points you'd like to elaborate on?
Yeah, well, I think with artificial intelligence, it's really challenging because you have these algorithms that are often proprietary, and it's hard to see inside them, right? So normally with like monitoring discrimination, it's a bit more straightforward than that. And the way you gather evidence and the way that you assess, are they following certain protocols, or are they saying things that are biasing the process? It's a lot more challenging to assess because you need to know enough about the technology to be able to know how it works. And you need to know the legal infrastructure, which will vary by country or by state or province, right? So that's why when we talk about capacity, it's important to start thinking about like who's going to have to be at the table to come up with that process. But I think that another thing that we could think about when it comes to AI algorithms is, and I'm not a technologist, but I think it helps to know how a lot of time, like if you think about HireVue, which is the interviewing software I mentioned, it will train the machine learning on the existing workforce to figure out what are the characteristics that these people have. And then if you think about the bell curve of variation, it's going to basically find patterns and in terms of what are their characteristics, and then when it's looking for candidates, it's going to try to match people that fit that curve, right? So there's a norming tendency to AI, and that's where the bias can come in. So there's this tension between, trying to go outside the norm and sort of break out of that normative pattern versus like repeating, if you're trying to think about equity and who works in, let's say, tech, then how do you make sure that you're not just filtering out for white men, right, who tend to be the ones that work in tech? Like there might be a lot of variables you're capturing incidentally that are like a cultural artifact that ends up sort of weeding people out on things that aren't actually relevant to weed them out on in the algorithm, if that makes sense. So I think it helps to learn a bit about the technology and to think through how it actually works and what the risks are.
I think those are great points.
Yeah.
Anything we go to the audience, Allyson?
I will just add that there are amazing people doing work to address algorithmic bias, such as EdSafe AI Alliance, and I heard from them this morning, and their work focuses on this problem exactly. So connecting with them and then having them at the table, people that know the technology, is very important.
I agree. And these capacities and how they're different around the world. I know there are people in the room with understanding of what that looks like locally, and I'd love to hear from you all on these points. Any other questions or comments for our panelists on the HED side? Take your time.
One thing we'd like to do with this landscape paper is get input from you all. Like, are there questions under the equity bucket or the interoperability? Are there questions we're missing? Are there things that you've been thinking about in your context that we should make sure we put in the framework, as we start to finalize and build it out?
One for me was finance. I think we're being very gentle by not talking about funding. when you think about an agile framework and capacities and infrastructure and this realistic scope and measuring success, in a development context, measuring success is known to be very difficult. Getting reliable data is known to be difficult. Finding talent, known to be difficult. And user input when they're uninformed. So, I mean, this is what makes the challenges so interesting to engage with, is that there's so many factors to engage. But when you didn't mention finance, I thought that was something to raise, and I was curious why that was, something clearly you would have considered, but you didn't put that in the top of your framework. Can you say anything more about the funding aspects, or how that might be different between the United States and other contexts that you might have studied?
Yeah, and well, the funding is complicated even in the US context, because it's all allocated within an existing budgeting structure, which is really designed for that procurement model that I mentioned before, which is we're going to procure a new system,
right,
and it's going to cost X, and then we have, Accenture or Deloitte build it, right? And so even in that context, I think it really requires capacity and rethinking all the budgeting processes and where the funding comes from. And so the funding is going to have to be more flexible, and it's going to have to be more based on intermediary outcomes and not necessarily on like long-term impacts. But that's part of why you want to scope it very carefully, because you want to say, I'm looking at, our goal in this iteration is to check for, we want to see some movement on this particular indicator.
Absolutely.
But I think you're right that the funding structure is really critical.
And we need to grapple with that and engage, and including online. If you have questions and comments, I hope you're also following along and putting in thoughts, because if we're missing something, we want to track it later if we can. Questions or comments? Something we missed so far? Yeah, sure. Simone, if we can pass a mic. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We hear you.
Okay. My name is Simone. I live and work from Italy, but typically the remit of what we do is global. I work for an organization that issues digital credentials, mostly in the higher education space, parchment. I had a reflection on the AI piece, which I think in the context of the report is mostly around, can we match skills to job or recommend learning pathways? But when I look at this in the context of UNESCO, and the Global Recognition Convention, so just applying the same algorithms to streamline recognition procedures, which are still cumbersome in a sense. On one hand, it could be exciting and help solve a problem, streamline mobility of students, but at the same time, it disrupts a whole profession. Credential evaluators and the whole recognition scaffolding that exists. And so I guess it's an open thought, like where AI comes in to help, but how it just kind of displaces the current infrastructure that we have around recognition, for example.
Great, and thanks for mentioning the recognition convention. We can come back to that. Maybe, would you like to take this first?
Sure. Well, I'll just have a quick response, which is I've been trying to think a lot about like qualification frameworks and how tech and qualification frameworks intersect, and which pieces of that process can be integrated and how. I don't have the answer,
sure,
but I would love to get ideas about that, and what is the vision that we could work towards, because some countries don't even have qualification frameworks, and some countries have them and don't really use them much. So
big issues, and how they're understood, how those qualifications are understood by employers, something you mentioned in your talk. We might want to come back to that. Another question? All right, to Jackson? Yeah, great, thanks.
Hi there, Jackson Smith here with Learning Economy Foundation. Thank you so much, both of you, for a terrific talk. It was fascinating. I want to highlight and dig deeper in on the communities that are overlooked. I love the conversation about, especially in the States, incarcerated communities and the opportunities, where a lot of these labor and education technologies, when the system is working for people, right now, like it is hard to see the value of some of these technologies. And I feel like some of the communities that you're discussing here, have some of the most to gain in terms of if it's properly designed with security and control. And so, my question is, what are the other communities that we're overlooking? What are the communities, to Wesley's point, that investment should be, flagged for and targeted at?
Do you want to go first?
Great question, thanks.
We're looking for benefits for the most disadvantaged communities. I know that the Learning Economy Foundation is working with refugees and migrants and recording their skills to help them get jobs. But we're also looking for people who don't have digital literacy or have a very foundational level. And how can we get them to move fast in this timeline? If they come from different countries, how can they compare to the United States? Or how can they move with progress and not be left behind?
Right, so the idea here is not that you're trying to replace in-person and one-on-one mentoring and education, but actually complementing it and using it, like in the incarcerated context, to free up time for those counselors to spend more customized time with someone. They take that curricula and then they have questions, they have someone there they can go through that with one-on-one. And the same idea, I think other populations that I think about, especially people with disabilities of different kinds, people who have mobility challenges and can't get to a classroom, and people who are in remote locations. I mean, people talk a lot about digital nomads among the most privileged of us, but there's also ways in which we could expand access to work experience and learning opportunities much more broadly at all levels. If we can really help people get to the level where they're more digitally literate.
Agree. And I'd love to elaborate on that point if there's not another question. Questions, thoughts? Any reflections so far? I'm curious on how we're teaching learning outcomes, for example, for incarcerated individuals. How are you making those links? Is it for high school degrees? Is it for specific, TVET qualifications? Because I'm looking for that higher education angle, which is, are we trying to track people into the traditional higher education system, or how do you see kind of linking their needs with the offering that's currently available?
I think it has to be a both and. So I think you could start earlier with the sort of like, here's a mock job interview, here's a mentorship exchange you can have interactively in the software, like think of video game almost, like interactive. But, and this is part of the quality assurance process.
Right.
If these digital badges remain the second tier option that we give people that don't get the real degree, how do you avoid tracking people into lower wage dead-end jobs because the employers aren't seeing those as prestigious or as high status, right? So I think that we should be building in, first of all, we should be getting more applied, we should allow people to get more applied degrees so that if you're doing something that's more work-based and applied, like cybersecurity has to be work-based and applied, and we're not building enough pipeline of people in the traditional university system. So how do we make sure that when someone is learning on the job more, they're getting actually a degree for that learning? And secondly, also to make sure that if you're building a learning platform in a prison, that part of the options there are online degree programs that maybe now only 2 facilities in the whole country give people a college degree in that area. But now more people could have access to more programs, because some facilities have absolutely nothing, and some have, basket weaving and whatnot. But others have actual, you can take a degree in sociology. And how do you make sure that every facility has that, and not just the ones where they happen to have more resources or leadership that happens to be, trying to think about that?
It's incredibly powerful when you think about this need to transform and engage diverse communities. I mean, this for me is something, when I read the bio and scope for this talk, I thought, we're missing it. We're missing so many local communities, and higher education institutions can use this opportunity to engage more deeply and identify their local needs and make sure that those degrees and credits are awarded and they're relevant, track those individuals across their life. For the incarcerated individuals, are there any examples of universities providing, inputs to curriculum and quality assurance directly? I mean, are there institutions that are more engaged in this and said, I see myself in this challenge?
Yes, there are. A lot of facilities do have degree programs from specific universities, but it's offered in the one place, right? And that's true outside of incarceration too. You'll have training programs in automation that happen in Kentucky, but they don't happen, in Southern California. So I think that if we use these platforms to complement and scale access to curricula rather than recreating the wheel all the time and trying to develop new curricula for each local area, then it actually gives you the ability to cater it to specific communities, like a person who's incarcerated. So one of the people we're working with is Marcus Bullock, who created a school. It's a business school, an entrepreneurship school for people who are incarcerated, taught by someone who's been incarcerated. So like seeing that mentor and having that person speak from their own experience allows you to really customize the curricula for that population. And you could do the similar thing for people with disabilities, right? Where you're getting a mentoring session from someone who has that experience, and that can be great for building someone's confidence and giving them like a role model that they can work from.
And the technology piece becomes that enabler, the data standards, an enabler to make this all interconnected. I'm curious, other questions from the audience? We still have a few minutes before we wrap up. I'd love to hear who else is active in this space on data standards. Kind of how do we build alliances so that we don't feel like we're navigating this in our own country contexts alone? Because people will go back and say, where do I start? Where do I get started with something as complex as data standards, and how to make this aligned and how to use technology wisely?
Yeah, we're actually, the learning economy folks and Wes, we're having a reception at around 5:30 in the terrace in the main conference center. I don't know if it has a specific name, but,
no problem.
but we're going to be meeting there later if you would like to chat with us or connect with folks in this space.
Great. I think that's it. This was a wonderful talk, and I think we can go into depth and more discussion, and including online. But let's give a big round of applause to our wonderful speakers, Annelies and Allyson.
Thank you.
Thank you for your contributions.
Thank you.
We'll take a few minutes break, and then we'll start in about 10 minutes with our next HED talk.